The right to protest is an important right in any liberal democracy. But do we let things go too far here in Canada? Today we're going to talk about this issue, but first here's a couple examples to consider. In early 2020, we saw a number of protests in Canada that were in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. There was a natural gas pipeline that was proceeding in British Columbia called the Coastal GasLink Pipeline. And we saw a number of protests prop up in Canada, including cases where people were blocking train lines, literally sitting in the middle of train tracks and putting all kinds of materials in the way that would stop trains from getting from A to B. Now, fast forward a year or two, and we saw a protest in Manitoba where some protesters were upset about residential schools. And they toppled a statue of Queen Victoria on the front lawn of the Manitoba legislature. They did this in broad daylight, and the head popped off the statue, and allegedly the cost was about $500,000 to repair this, and no one was charged. Many viewers will remember the Freedom Convoy. We saw thousands of people descend on Ottawa with their trucks and their vehicles, and they parked their vehicles in the middle of the street for weeks on end. In Alberta, we saw people actually block the border crossing between Alberta and Montana in the United States. And then more recently, we've seen protests in solidarity with Palestinian people. In Toronto, we saw a famous picture where some police officers were delivering donuts from some protesters who were not allowed to reach some other protesters who had decided to block an overpass for a busy highway. So are these reasonable? Are they crossing the line? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I've got two great guests who have been following this issue. Josh Dehaas is counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and Tristan Hopper is a columnist reporter with the National Post. Thank you both for joining me today. So, Josh, I want to start off with you. Could you tell us just right at the beginning, what does the law allow in terms of protests in this country?
Well, so under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you have a right to peaceful assembly. And the courts have been pretty reticent to actually tell us exactly what they think that means. But obviously, the word peaceful is there. And so we know that there are some pretty obvious limits. And to figure out what those limits are, we sort of look to the freedom of expression jurisprudence, which says that you can protest, you can speak and say whatever you want, whatever your message is, as long as it's not crossing the line into something like criminal hate speech. But there are reasonable restrictions based on the time, the manner, and the place of the protest. And just to sort of explain quickly, a time restriction that's considered reasonable is, you can't occupy a park overnight. And so it's acceptable for police to arrest people under a law that says you can't stay in the park overnight to protest. In terms of a manner restriction, obviously, damaging property, committing violence, riots, that's not going to be covered by peaceful protest. And the really big one is blockading. So, you have a right to sort of march through the streets and keep your protest moving because that's historically covered by the rights, but you can't set up a blockade like on a railway line, like we saw with the Wet'suwet'en protest that you referenced, because that is not going to be considered a peaceful protest.
So why is it then that we do see these blockades, whether it's the Wet'suwet'en or the blockade at the Alberta border during the Freedom Convoy? Why is it that they're allowed to do this for days on end before the police step in and start to remove people?
Yeah, so the jurisprudence has not been particularly clear, but a lot of this is just police feeling that this is a better way to enforce the law to try and, negotiate with protests for weeks on end, because that will, avoid PR disasters like we've seen in the past. For example, in Ontario, there was a big case in the 1990s where an Indigenous protester was shot during a police raid at a place called Ipperwash, and that caused police to be really reticent to enforce the law. But there is criminal law against blockading. It's called intimidation. You can't stand on the sidewalk, you can't stand in the road and blockade people. And we've actually recently started to see police enforce this a little bit more. But I think that reticence really comes from just sort of the public relations of, getting it wrong and police overreacting to that.
Okay. Well, listen, we'll be back with more in just a few minutes.